Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of the Islam Through the Ages podcast. I'm your host, Taqib Musa. And today we're talking about a potentially controversial subject. We don't think it's controversial. And we're joined by an expert on the topic, Ustad Mohammed Ahmed. He's a PhD candidate focusing on Asian and Middle Eastern studies. And his dissertation is actually analyzing various tafasir or Quran exegesis books. So Tabari, Ibn Kathir, and I think you said Qatil?
Muqatil, yeah.
Muqatil, sorry, and Muqatil. Specifically with Tabari, we're very, very interested because it focuses on the representation of Medinan Jews. And Tabari, of course, is considered to be the most comprehensive early tafsir work. We're going to be delving into a little bit of detail into Muslim-Jewish relationships, and we're not just going to be going into the detail that's in the Tabari, which was compiled around 3 centuries after the Prophet's time. Actually, we'll go a little bit deeper into what did this mean for various Muslim communities. So we'll talk a little bit about Andalusia. We'll talk about actually the history of it, and this is a question that we often have around Islamic history. We tend to start the discussion at 1400 years ago at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But actually, can we argue that Abrahamic history, we also have a right to it, and actually all of the history of the prophets, and actually we can go a little bit further behind that, and we'll talk about specific instances within history, and let's see how much we get to. We might have to do a part 2, so we've been a little bit ambitious with the list that we are trying to cover. I think you started out with a BA in English and History from the University of Southampton. So, a lot of kind of historical research and exactly the type of academic that we want to discuss this with. So I want to start off with, when we talk about the interaction of Jews and Muslims as, the followers of the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So starting out, when we hear about it in the Quran, the verses about the children of Israel, and the prophets, and the engagement, or how did the Sahaba engage with that, and then how did that reflect into the Prophet ﷺ's interaction with the Jews of Medina?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Quran, of course, uses multiple terms when referring to Jews. Popular terms such as Banu Israel, or the children of Israel. The word Yahud, meaning Jews, or Alladina Hadu. And there are other such terms that are used in relation to Ahlul Kitab, of course, encompassing both Christians and Jews. And Khalid Duran, a scholar, wrote a hypothesis essentially arguing that whenever the Quran uses the term Banu Israel, it's using it in a legacy sense. So it's referring to the legacy of the Banu Israel, mainly referring to the historical group, or let's say the historical notion of Jews, perhaps the early followers of Musa alayhi salam, or those who predated the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when it comes to the ones that are more contemporary to the Prophet Muhammad, so really referring to the Jews of Medina in this case, then the term Yahud is used rather than Banu Israel in the Quran. And in my research, I think that's pretty much true. There are, of course, exceptions either way. But generally that is what's going on in the Quran. And also in the Quran, for that reason, Banu Israel is generally the more positive term, or let's say ambivalent term. When it comes to castigating or praising the Banu Israel, it's much easier to do it with that term. And when the term Yahud is used, it's generally more in more harsh terms or castigating terms than in praiseworthy terms. And that's how I would sort of lineate the historical reality of the terms. And then with that, you can really understand a lot more. So, for instance, with documents like the Constitution of Medina, which is a very early document that is written in Medina to unite the people really in an agreement. It's a ahad, it's a sulh, it's a bay'ah, it's all these really technical terms of engagement and a pledge of allegiance between what are the followers of Muhammad, the Muslims, and the Jews of Medina. And only believers are, of course, allowed to engage in this what's called a promissory oath, which is an oath before God. So if you're making an oath with somebody before God, you must also acknowledge that that person believes in God, and that person must acknowledge that you believe in God in order for that oath to be valid. And Stefan Esders wrote a bit about promissory oaths, and in my article I sort of link that to the constitution and demonstrate how the constitution of Medina, is one of those promissory oaths. So really, in early Islam, and the term Yahud is used within that text, not Banu Israel. But still there's an admission that the belief of the Yahud of Medina, the Jews of Medina, and the belief of the Muslims of Medina is similar, or the same, at least in the conception of God and what an oath would entail. And within within that text, the term Yahud is used rather than Banu Israel. So for that, we need to also bear in mind that there is a sort of fluidity really in early Medina when it comes to sort of admitting the iman, shall we say, of the Jews and vice versa. And you could see that as, from a historical perspective, as a sort of the Muslims and Jews getting on really in early Islam, and that is what I would argue was the historical reality in early Medina.
So I'm gonna just pick up on that term Yahud. So where does that come from? So we've got people of the book, right, referring to scripture. Where does the term Yahud come from?
So Yahud, which is, I'll link this to something in a second, but so Yahud comes from Yahuda, which is one of the tribes. So the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah is one of the tribes, which is where we get the term Judaism from, in English and in pretty much all languages. So the term doesn't have any sort of biblical basis. It's not really a term that Jews call themselves. It just, as history went on, it became the term for the people who were doing these sorts of practices and believed in these similar things. And so within, for example, the tafsir of Muqatil, which is very early on. So he's a contemporary of Abu Hanifa. So very, very early on within the Islamic intellectual development, shall we say. He explains that the term Yahud comes from the term Yahuda, which is what I just explained. And if we look at later tafasir, what they tend to do is they tend to not necessarily ground these terms in their historical reality, and they tend to Arabize them and try and understand where they come from. So, Yahud could be alladhina hadu, those who returned back to God, those who did tawbah. So that could also, could also link to that, and other such explanations as to why the term Yahud is used.
And so, sorry, go.
No, it's the same with the term Nasara, right? So if you look at, so Nasara, of course, is Nazarene, right? So Jesus of Nazareth. Nazarenes were what the early Christians called themselves. So Nasara is the Arabic, and the same is the Syriac church used a similar term as well. So that term is what's used in Arabic. But if you look at later Islamic theologians, they sort of almost forget that historical reality and try and rationalize, okay, why is Nasara used? Well, Nasara could be linked to Nasr, which is to aid or to help. And, the Christians in Abyssinia helped the Muslims in early Islam. So it could be that. And you'll see different rationalizations. And this is what tends to happen as you go later on within the Islamic tradition.
So that's, I think, last question on the starting of it, which is, we know Israel was a name taken by Yaqub alayhi salam, Jacob, and then he had 12 sons. Is it that Judaism only comes from the Judah branch, so one of the 12, or is it a case of actually that's maybe an encompassing term, as you said, and actually it's, Jewish can mean you're from any of the 12 tribes?
Well, there was actually two kingdoms. There was the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And it's just a historical reality. The kingdom of Judah lasted, and because of that, that was just the term that ended up being associated. So of course if you hear the term Israelites, for instance, right, that could be a sort of equal term. But because of the kingdom and it lasting and actually defeating Israel, then because of that, the term Judaism was used.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. So I think now if we fast forward, so we're talking about, Kingdom of Judah, Kingdom of Israel, which is very much before even the is this, we're talking BC era, so after Moses, before Jesus, or where do we situate these?
Yeah, I'm not really an expert on like sort of early Judaism, but yeah, we're talking a long time BC
Yeah.
basically. And in the very early period, of course, you have the different temple eras, which is generally how historians sort of chronologically break up the early Jewish period, and then until Christ comes, and then until Islam comes. Of course, there's 600 years between them. But the Quran does make, for example, reference to the destruction of the temple. Temple was destroyed a number of times, and in the final time, you see a really big schism within Judaism, because the temple is an essential part of Judaism, an essential part of Jewish life. Most of the rituals actually revolve around the temple rather than anything else. And so Judaism as a theology actually develops quite a lot later, in the way that we know it today, that you can practice from wherever you are in the world and that sort of thing. Well, that was because there was an exile, and Jews left after the temple was destroyed. And because of that, Judaism developed in different pockets, but remaining in contact with each other. And then we get a sort of rabbinic Judaism that tries to rationalize, okay, why were we kicked out of Jerusalem? Why was the temple destroyed? And in so doing, a sort of new theology emerges. And so Judaism isn't this sort of, and this is another thing to bear in mind about any historical investigation into Jews or Judaism, is what Judaism is being discussed here. Because you have, for example, in South Arabia, you have the Himyar, Kingdom of Himyar. But we have indications that it was not necessarily a rabbinic Judaism, and it may have been a different type of sort of more militant Judaism, and there's been different studies on that, and so it's really important. For example, if we're looking at Islam, okay, what Jews are we talking about here? And really, by the time of the Prophet Muhammad arriving to the Hijaz, really you have rabbinic Jews are essentially the thing, which is quite similar to how Jews are today. So we're not talking a very, very disparate, very different group. They are very similar to how Jews are today in many senses. For example, in kosher laws and things like that, you'll find very, very strong similarities. You do find some differences. For example, we have texts like the Cairo Geniza, which you may be aware of, which is a big sort of suppository of text that was discovered in Cairo. And for many hundreds of years, Jews were essentially putting documents into that synagogue and locking it, and putting more in and locking it over the centuries. And so now it's a massive historical sort of goldmine, really. And then some Cambridge academics went and brought it back to the University of Cambridge. So we have that here now, and people have been analyzing it for many years now. And if you look at those texts, for example, you see Jews, some Jews, for example, worshipping concept of Metatron, which is an angel, and so a sort of little Yahweh that he's called, and the ayah then, which is about those who say that the Messiah is the Son of God, and those who say that Uzair is the Son of God, starts to make sense. Because for many years, Muslim theologians didn't actually know why the Quran says that. Why does the Quran say that the Jews say that Uzair is the son of God? Who is Uzair? A. B. Jews are monotheists like Muslims. What or Unitarian monotheists like Muslims. What's going on here? And really, if you look at how Jews how Jewish practice changed over many centuries, you can find a lot of these links. And so a lot of Middle Eastern Jews used to worship a little Yahweh or Metatron, which could be what's being referenced to in this verse. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I think it's something to read a lot about. I've not heard the term Metatron before. And yeah, it gives very Transformers-y vibes, but I did not know it was a real concept. So let's if we fast forward now to the advent of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then after him. I think you mentioned the Medinan Treaty specifically, but also as we go on into early Muslim Caliphate, so we enter the Rashidun period and then the Umayyad and Abbasid periods. How were Jews treated in those early Muslim Caliphates?
Yeah, so let's take it era by era. So in the very early period, in early Medina, I'm very much simplifying here, but in early Medina, relations were very good between Muslims and Jews. The Constitution of Medina declares equal rights between Muslims and Jews. It declares freedom of religion, freedom of practice, and other such sort of equality statements that really reflect a religious plurality in Medina. That's what's to be said about early Medina. However, in late Medina, there is a political breakdown in relations between Muslims and Jews, and for this, really, we have two main evidences, shall we say. We have the Sirah tradition, or the historical tradition, Tariq, shall we say, which lists Muslim disagreements and subsequent military engagements with three main tribes: the Banu Qurayza, the Banu Qaynuqa, and the Banu Nadir, who are major Jewish tribes living in Medina. The second main evidence that we have is a shift in tonality in the Quran. So the Quran is largely, shall we say, positive of Jews and Jewish legacy in the Meccan period and in the early Medinan period, and then there's a tonal shift, and it starts to be a little bit more condemnatory. You start to get ayat about la tattakhiduhum awliya and these types of ayat, which really require a contextual understanding. And the context is that there has been a political breakdown in relations, right? And this is what a lot of Muslims maybe don't quite grasp when it comes to why the Quran has a dual tonality about many things, right? And we have a tradition of asbab an-nuzul, right? That there's a reason for revelation and a context for revelation for every verse. And in order to understand, what the Quran is saying about Jews, you also need to really understand what's happening on the ground. Now, there are a contingent of historians who will say, well, we can't really trust the seerah, we can't really trust the tariq materials. And they say, well, Islam is an oral tradition. This was all written down a lot later. There are a number of, shall we say, weak hadith transmissions. Because of all of that, we can't trust the hadith tradition. Now, that may stand alone as an argument, but if we're using the Quran, right, and the Quran is also reflects a shift in tonality, then that doesn't really agree with that hypothesis. Then the Quran is also reflecting that there was a breakdown in relations, and you can know that just from the Arabic language, just from doing a semantic analysis of the Quran. But also, it does have to be said that it may have been that the three tribes of Medina, for instance, and the Muslim political disturbances with them was probably over-exaggerated in the Islamic tradition. So, for instance, there are many hadith about, for example, the massacre of the Banu Qurayza, and these, a lot of Muslims and non-Muslims have difficulty in wrapping their head around how and why this happened, especially Muslims who see Islam as, as maybe this doesn't correspond with the rahmah of the Prophet ﷺ or that type of thing. But it does need to be said that also there's an asbab al-nuzul of the Quran, but there's an asbab al-nuzul of these historical documents as well, as in there's a context to them. So for instance, when these hadith were being codified and written down in really the Abbasid era, there were some political disturbances in those regions. So the Abbasid Caliph, there was Abu Isa al-Isfahani, for example, who was a Jewish messianic sort of claimant, and he led a revolt actually against the Abbasid Caliph. And the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur at the same time commissions Ibn Ishaq to write the very first seerah, right? This is all happening in tandem, right? And Ibn Ishaq in the very first seerah is one of the first people who writes about the Banu Qurayza, for instance. And so in order to demonstrate that the Muslim political authority is not going to take any sort of disturbances from these religious minority groups, what better way than to, let's say, emphasize or maybe over-exaggerate how the Prophet ﷺ would have dealt with them, right? And in so doing, you get a much harsher depiction of what Medina may have been like. And this continues and continues, and until you get quite a, people think of a sort of fatalistic dichotomy between Muslims and Jews that's always based on disharmony, which is not true, because the historical reality doesn't actually support that. And there have been many scholars who've written on this, including Barakat Ahmed, for example, who wrote something quite a while ago, sort of listing similar types of, and his rationale. He also mentions about some of the children of the Banu Qurayza who were the actual sources for the massacre in the Islamic texts, and that they may have exaggerated because they were the children and felt upset and that sort of thing. So he gives a number of different arguments as well. But it is important to bear in mind that it's important that these texts grow up in a historical reality, and there's a purpose, for which they're received.
Right, that's very interesting. So it's not a case of it never happened. So Banu Qurayza in the Battle of Ahzab, the Confederates, that there was treachery, and then perhaps 700 were put to the sword. Actually, it could be the number could have been 400 or 500, but it definitely did happen, because I've heard certain complete denials, or this would never happen, or as you said, some people think that this doesn't sit right with them from what Islam should represent from a mercy of the Prophet.
Yeah, I mean that would depend on what your historical sort of principles are, right? So if someone was a historian and the historical principle is to accept Islamic tariq materials, then it definitely happened. But if your historical principle is to be skeptical towards Islamic tradition, then you probably will say it never happened, because of the reasons I mentioned. And also, for example, the Constitution of Medina does not mention these three tribes at all, but it mentions the Jews of Medina and all the other tribes, right? And so, if one were a skeptical historian of Islamic sources, you might say, well, it probably didn't happen, and it could be an Abbasid construction, a literary construction for political ends, right? So that would really depend. Obviously, the average Muslim would accept the historical, shall we say, reality of most authentic hadith, right? Not all of them, but most of them. And in so doing, events like that would be considered true. But also, there's the other perspective as well. Yeah.
And that other perspective is also within the Muslim orthodoxy, or is it a slightly modern / niche opinion?
I mean, the problem with history is that there's no historical orthodoxy, right? When it comes to Islam, it's not like fiqh where you have 4 schools. It's not like Aqidah where you have Maturidis, Ash'aris, etc., and everyone agrees. With history, you have different opinions, really. Having said that, I haven't heard any sort of major Islamic scholars who are Islamic scholars from the traditional point of view mention that it's not a true event. However, I have heard many Muslim academics, many Muslim academics who don't think that it was a historical reality. And I mean, I don't think it was, at least in the way that the Islamic sources present it. It probably wasn't. It wasn't how it was presented in a lot of those texts.
Okay, very interesting. Very interesting. So now if we go on, so we've looked at the Prophet's period. Now we're looking at the Rashidun Caliphs, and then I think you've mentioned a little bit of the Abbasids, so we'll come back to that in terms of the revolts and things.
Yes. So after the Prophet sallallahu passes away, you really have the next main leader who engages with Jews in a political level is Umar ibn al-Khattab, so the second Rashidun Caliph. And of course, there's famously this whole Pact of Umar, right? What is this Pact of Umar? When was it written? Who is it about? These are all questions that are really still up for debate. Some say it's not about Umar at all. It's about Umar II. So it's about the Umayyad Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz who wrote this, who's not that long afterwards, but he's afterwards. And whatever that opinion is, we have within the Islamic tradition some sort of historical tales, shall we say, about how Umar treated the Jews. There is one of that Umar exiled or accepted the exile of Jews to Syria, and that the Jews of the Hijaz vacated the area. That could be true. We know that when Muslims were conquering Palestine, for example, and that you know there was a large Muslim army, there may have been Jews in that army. From, for example, the Arabian Peninsula.
In the Muslim side.
Well, we don't really know, but this is
Okay.
a conjecture, right? Because at this point we're looking at a probabilistic truth, right? We're looking at a truth that is probably there based on the sources. We can't say too many things for definite from a historical from an academic point of view. And we know that, for example, Abdullah ibn Salam was in the army, and we know that he converted. He's a rabbi from Medina who converted to Islam. But again, you know, we're looking at that through later sources. So there may have been certain Jews, for example, who may have fought with the Muslims. We know that when the Muslims conquered Palestine, they reinstated Jews at the Temple Mount and said that, no, this is your place of worship, you may worship here. And so there may have been reasons for doing that. And so really in the Umayyad period, it's in the Rashidun period, it's very hazy. You know, it's very hazy to really understand what's going on. We don't have texts like the Constitution of Medina or the Quran, which are so very clear. Pact of Umar may be from slightly later. And the Pact of Umar, really what it does is it codifies this whole dhimmi concept, right? And we have this concept in history and Islamic history of this concept of the dhimmi. And it's become a sort of negative term for some reason, which is very far from the truth. So dhimmi literally means protected. These are legally protected individuals. And what a lot of people do is they look at the Pact of Umar and they say, oh, okay, well, this clause is, let's say, derogatory, Christians and Jews are not allowed to do X. They're not allowed to do Y. They're not allowed to dress like this. But actually what it was doing, it's very similar to the Constitution of Medina in that it is protecting their status, right? So the Constitution of Medina says the Jews have their religion, the Muslims have their religion. And you may look at that and say, well, that's Muslims trying to distance themselves. Not necessarily, actually. It's the protection of the religion of the Jews, right? In Medina, that your religion is protected under law. And likewise, their identity of what they were doing and their practices were protected under law, according to the dhimma concept. And because we live in the world that we live in today of nation states, it might be difficult for us to understand what the historical reality is. But just to mention one point, which I think will help a lot of listeners to understand just how Jews and Christians were treated in the Muslim world. Muslim political authorities really didn't want to get involved with Christians or Jews that much because they were a protected minority. They had complete independence. It was almost like a de facto state within a state, as we have today. And so, when they had their own judges, they had their own laws, they had their own, diets. They were allowed to, for example, have pigs and wine and that sort of thing. Christians were explicitly allowed that sort of stuff in the Pact of Umar, and so really it's a protection of them and their identities more than anything else. We see cases. The only time really where Muslims get involved, generally speaking, is when there's a sort of a fight amongst themselves. So let's say the Jewish community has a fight amongst itself. Then they'll refer to the caliph or the governor or whoever, and they'll ask him, and he will give a judgment. But generally speaking, the Muslim political authorities didn't really want to get involved. That is that is a high degree of autonomy that we don't even have now in the West, living as Muslims, for example, or in other communities have in other nation states. It doesn't exist. There's a common law for everyone, right? And so, you know, that's sort of how we really need to understand this dhimmi concept. And as it continues, sort of, you know, you have the emergence of the major schools, for example, the major fiqh schools of Islam. And yeah, so as they develop, you see two slightly different understandings or conceptions of Jews. And this is because within the Islamic tradition, we have what I would call a theological perception of Jews, and we have a fiqhi or jurisprudential perception of Jews. So the theological perception of Jews may be, let's say, similar to certain Christian criticisms, or let's say not believing in Jesus, for instance, right? That's a theological problem that Islam has with Judaism as a religion, right? But when it comes to, and other such things, right? Not accepting the Prophet Muhammad, etc., right? Those are about beliefs, and those are about a Muslim imaginary, right? However, when it comes to the fiqhi or the jurisprudential engagement between Muslims and Jews, it's very different, right? You can marry Jews. This is explicit within the Quran. You can eat their food. They can eat your food, etc., etc. And actually, so you have two very different images of Muslim-Jewish engagement, right? One is quite liberal, and it's law related, and it's to the day-to-day interaction between Muslims and Jews. We know from the Cairo Geniza, what I mentioned earlier, we know that Muslim Jewish traders used to cooperate. They used to celebrate each other's holidays. They used to send gifts to each other. This was all very normal within Islamic history. On the same token, you know, there were the development of certain attitudes that criticize Jews, but they're criticizing the theology rather than Jews per se, or right? So they're criticizing from a theological perspective. And that's really important to understand, because Christianity only really has one perspective of Jews, because it's not a fiqhi or jurisprudential tradition. Christianity doesn't have a jurisprudence like Islam and Judaism has. Christianity really is an ethical movement, and it responds to Judaism by saying, okay, well, we don't want a jurisprudential tradition, and it just has a theological conception of Jews. And that's why you get so much rhetoric in Christian history about Jews, because it's all about rhetoric. It's all about, you know, labels and that sort of thing, rather than an actual sanctioned interaction, shall we say, between Christians and Jews. So Islam really is very much in the middle when it comes to that.
That's very interesting. I wanted to pick up on one specific point that you said about Jewish presence in the Hijaz. So what I've kind of been aware of, and perhaps has riddled with misconceptions, is there was a Jewish community in the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. From Medina, they were expelled, and Banu Qurayza were the last to be expelled. And once they left, there were actually no more Jews left, and they went to Khaybar. And then from Khaybar, when after the Battle of Khaybar, when Jews were expelled from there, that was the last of Jews in the Arabian Peninsula, so to speak. Maybe there were some pockets left around, perhaps in Yemen, but actually most of them had migrated up north. What you're saying seems to actually counter that, in that actually they were still around. And then when the Pact of Umar happens, are we then talking about Jewish communities who were based in the newly conquered lands of Asham and Yemen and, you know, and other areas, or actually these were actually Jews in Medina who could buy and sell alcohol and have pigs and those types of things?
Okay, so that two parts to that. There were Jews in Medina. There were Jews in Medina at the time of Umar. That's clear in Islamic sources. And in time of Abu Bakr, time of Umar, you have athar and hadith that refer to that. So one could rationalize and say, okay, perhaps the hadiths that refer to Jews leaving are talking about a general group, and that pockets were remaining, like you're saying, or that they are sort of, it's more of a retrospective, you know, simplification, shall we say, and that Jews were there for a lot longer. And there's a historian, Benjamin of Toledo, so from Islamic Spain, I think in the 13th century. which was, I think, at that point Christian, goes to the Medina, and he says that there are still Jews in Medina, for instance. So you have, I mean, we don't know if he's a reliable source or not really about that specific point, but you do have some indication that there are Jews there. Also, we must bear in mind, and this is really important, that there are Jews to the north in the Levant, there are Jews to the south in Yemen, there are Jews to the west in Egypt, there are Jews to the east, and so there are Jews really everywhere. Just the fact that they're in the Hijaz is not inconceivable within Islamic history. You know, it's really not like a strange thing. Yeah, that's what I would say about Jews living there. And also what you were mentioning about pigs and wine, that's mainly in reference to Christians in Sham. Of course, when the Muslims conquered former Byzantine territory, they were of course Christians. And for that reason, they, you know, Umar protects their way of life essentially, including that they're allowed to cultivate wine and, you know, have pigs, but they're prohibited from selling them to Muslims, right? So that's the condition. And so really that's mainly in reference to the Christians in the Levant, but has been applied to all manner of subjects living under Muslim rule. And the Hanafis famously applied it to the Hindus in the subcontinent. And so this is like, it's not a sort of it's not a new thing really. The dhimmi concept was en masse applied to those living under Muslim rule.
Yeah. So I think if we move on from there now to Umayyad period, and I think what's interesting specifically about there is there are reports, or the one point I really want to pick on is the concept of jizya, and actually there have been some reports of actually Umayyads discouraging people from accepting Islam. Was that primarily Christian or Jewish? Was that because they were trying to preserve jizya revenues, or was that something else? And actually, did that apply to Jews, or was it more because the expansion was eastward as well, so you had a lot of Zoroastrians coming under the fold? But yeah, how does that then change, or the interaction with Jews change in the Umayyad and later Abbasid periods?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you're unpacking something that a lot of Muslims don't consider. Is that Umayyad structure in general, societal structure, was in the way that we would refer to it now, quite racist. You know, they had a shu'ubiyya concept, which was like, you know, really only sort of Arabs can be Muslims, right? And if you convert to Islam, you need to attach yourself to an Arab family, that type of thing. Which is actually quite similar to Jewish law, just happens to be. If you convert to Judaism, you have to do the same thing. But anyway, so that type of societal structure in the beginning was okay because the Umayyads had such absolute power, right? However, as time goes on, it very quickly unravels because, like you say, the majority of the population is non-Muslim, actually, first of all, in the Muslim empire. The majority of the population is non-Muslim. And then having said that, even the Muslims, the most of the Muslims were converts, right? Or at least non-Arabs, right? You have a lot of Iranians, you have a lot of Syrians, etc., etc. And so as time goes on, the Umayyad policies become so unpopular that is exactly what the Abbasid revolution is based on. And the Abbasids are really arguing against this. And people like Abu Hanifa famously sided with the Abbasids against the Umayyads for this very reason, and for many other reasons as well. And so, you know, it really is like an unpopular thing. Also about jizya. So like you say, the people were discouraged from converting. The jizya can rise and fall, right, as far as I understand it, at the discretion of the caliph. And so at that point there were high jizya taxes, higher than the zakat. However, there have been periods in time where the jizya has been very low, which is also just serves to remind the audience that Islam was not necessarily out there just to tax non-Muslims and you know, bleed them dry. You know, that's really not the case. And sometimes the jizya was just as low as the zakat. And it's there really to fund the protection of these groups. And a side note, the Ottomans, for example, were the main complainants against the Ottomans were fellow Muslims who they were taxing very, very heavily as well towards the end of the caliphate. So, you know, yeah, that is a historical reality.
Okay, so that's quite interesting where we go into that. Um, there is examples, and the fear with examples is, are they the exception? So we have the example of Salahuddin, which is late Abbasid era, although he was outside Abbasid control technically. He had a Jewish physician, and there's a famous scene in the movie Kingdom of Heaven where he says, "I'll send you my physician," which is a Jewish physician that they're talking about. You have cases of in Beit al-Hikmah, Abbasid Baghdad, Jewish scholars working with Muslim scholars. And you have, several of those examples. You have a lot of cross-fertilization of scholars again in Andalusia. And are they mentioned because it's an exception, or is it just that they got picked up because of modern narratives? Because especially in the current day, and I don't know if we'll get to it today or we'll have to do a part two to come to the 20th century and onwards discussion. But is that in if we now look a little bit more broadly at Umayyad, Abbasid, and onwards going into Mamluk period, etc., is it normal for Jews to be in positions of power in the Muslim quote unquote empires, or is it an exception and that's why they're picked up?
Yeah, very much normal when it comes to Jews and Christians being in the courts, right? So in the court of the caliph or the court of the emir or sultan or whatever. Very normal. We have so many Jewish physicians in Islamic history that were physicians for Muslim leaders. And believe me, the list is very, very extensive. And Christians as well. And you mentioned the Beit al-Hikmah, and there were other such initiatives. And Jews and Christians and people of other religions were very much involved. And what people don't tend to look at is Judaism and Jews as a religion, for instance. They had two centers of learning in the medieval period, two basically almost like Rome is to Christians today. They had essentially two of them, Surah and Pumbedita, which are both very close to Kufa in Iraq, and very close to the center of learning, for example, of Abu Hanifa and these types of people. And these are contemporaneous. These, the Exilarch, who is the head of the Jews, would live there, and they would have their teaching and learning going on there. Huge population. When the city of Baghdad comes up, for example, which is also pretty close, as the city of Baghdad comes up, so many Jews move there that they have to make another center of learning in Baghdad. And so, we're talking heavy engagement between these populations. They're living together. There's not a sort of close off of the community. However, having said that, as I explained, the societal structure was such that these communities governed their own affairs. It wasn't that they were necessarily getting too involved in each other's affairs, unless there was this, a Muslim having, for example, an argument with a Jew. Then you can't choose one or the other. So the Muslim leader, who would be the general leader, would take control of that. So, and I mean, you have the famous Nagrilas, for example, in Muslim Spain, who become the de facto prime minister. I mean, the leader of Islamic Spain was Samuel ibn Nagrila, who was a Jewish Talmudic scholar who opened up Torah study centers throughout Andalusia, who helped fund them, who led the Muslim army against the Christians. This is not, the political leadership in that case is slightly out of the blue, but really Jews being involved at high positions in the Islamic world is really not new. And Christians as well. We know that early Umayyad courtiers many of them were Greek. Many of them were even recording things still in Greek in the Umayyad period, because that was the lingua franca really of the Levant. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's anything new.
You mentioned communities were still a little bit apart, so it's very interesting when you look at like Jerusalem, which has a Jewish quarter, and all these. Was that so? Even though everyone was quite integrated in terms of marketplaces and things like that. But actually, in terms of living, most people tended to live with their families, and that's just how things were done. Because comparing it to today, and I think sometimes when we think about this, we think about, oh yeah, all of them live together, very similar to how we do, for example, in the West today. And perhaps that example is not fair because they did still live in different quarters.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, you've summarized it. So they lived in separate quarters, and they governed their own affairs within those quarters. However, there were arenas of serious engagement. You know, whether it's trade, travel was a common one. You know, where there was serious engagement. You know, you're stuck on a ship for a month with X, Y, and Z, and they're often of different faiths and of different backgrounds, and that sort of thing. So, you know, there was some serious engagement. Having said that, like you say, the way that the society was living then was very dissimilar to the way that we live today, which is almost like nuclear families within, and our society is the nation, the whole nation, right? That wasn't the case beforehand.
So then we go to this classic example, Andalusia with Convivencia, or everyone, or this I think, and this is very interesting. And is it true? There's fabled period of lovely coexistence between Jews, Christians, and Muslims all together in Muslim Spain.
Yeah, so there were a number of historians from pretty much from the 70s who really popularized this idea of convivencia. So convivencia is sort of communal living where everyone's getting on, essentially. That's a summary of what convivencia is. So Islamic Spain is a little bit unique in that it has Christians, Jews, and Muslims throughout the country, right? So if you look at other places in the Muslim world, they might have pockets of let's say Jewish and Christian populations, but in Spain you have almost throughout the country you have all three religions existing. If you look at there are indications that the convivencia was real, and you look at some of the art that came out of there and how it reflects a mixed heritage, and you look at many things, and you do find that there's a convivencia going on. For example, many priests went to study in Muslim institutions, right? That wouldn't really happen today, for instance. And so in that sense, yes, you can say yes. However, having said that, there have been a number of scholars who argue against convivencia. And they would argue that, so I mentioned about Samuel ibn Naghrila. So his son, Yosef ibn Naghrila, he is killed because, well, he assumes leadership and then he is killed, and a number of Jews are massacred, right? And this is in 1066, the Granada Massacre, it's called. This is very much an outlier in Muslim-Jewish relations, and pogroms and these types of things are much rarer in Islamic history than they were in Christian history and Christian treatment of Jews. However, it has to be said that sometimes they happened. Sometimes and it was really mainly it was Muslim political leaders who didn't really understand Islamic law very well, generally speaking. That's why they would happen. And they were really for political gain. So again, it really boils down to the whole politics thing again and again. Whether it's good relations or bad relations, generally they're hinged on the political reality. But so certain historians would take the Granada massacre, for instance, and say, well, this is just typical of how Muslims treat Jews, and they've been doing this since the Banu Qurayza, and look at the way Muslims are treating Jews. That is the opposite view of the convivencia. So there are two main historical, let's say, narratives about how Muslims treated Jews in Al-Andalus, right? Both are oversimplifications. Right, both are wrong, really, to say it clearly. There were definitely elements of convivencia, and there were times when there was political and religious disturbances between different groups. That, as a historian, that for me that has very little to do with religion and more to do with politics, and how politics was appropriated to categorize people in these different groups and to for them to argue. And so really, when political relations are good and stable, that's the key term. When things are stable, Muslims and Jews get on very well. But when there is a breakdown, when there's a societal breakdown, when there's a political breakdown, economic breakdown, then all manner of confrontation breaks loose, and including between Muslims and Jews, but really on a general level, I would say as well. And so Convivencia, was it a real historical reality? No doubt there were elements of Convivencia in Islamic history, especially in Islamic Spain, without a doubt. Having said that, we need to be mature when we discuss Islamic Spain, right? And we can't just use rose-tinted lenses and say everything was perfect and Muslims, Jews, and Christians got on completely, because that also isn't the case. If we compare it to Christian Spain, then yes, Muslim Spain was almost heavenly compared to that when it came to treating minorities. And we know all about the Inquisition and the forced eviction of Muslims and Jews from an expulsion from Spain.
So I think now moving forward, so Andalusia is a very interesting example, and that's why we bring it up. And I think we probably have time for about one more question. So when we look at the Ottoman system now, and very much talking about the Millet system, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Ottomans were also similar in that actually the population was majority non-Muslim. How was the engagement with Jews there? Where did they reach, and how did the Millet system function to govern this coexistence?
Yeah, similar in a way, in that so they are a dhimmi group, they're a protected group. When, for instance, the Muslims and Jews were kicked out of Spain by the conquering Christians, many fled to the Ottoman Empire and sought refuge, really. And the Caliph explicitly asked Muslims to be welcoming to these Jewish refugees that were coming in. And there are many, if you go to Istanbul, they have many of the caliphal declarations, written in very beautiful script, asking people to treat Jews nicely, and they are your guests. They're your brothers, they're your cousins. Treat them well, essentially, in a nutshell. And so, the Ottoman Empire continues this tradition of allowing Muslims and Jews to live in relative harmony. And the Jewish community in Turkey, it still exists to this day, and I've met many of them myself. And they're very aware of the history of the Ottoman history regarding Jews, and how pluralistic and welcoming they were. And the Millet system is very similar to the dhimmi system I was talking about, in that it also enshrines, the Ottoman Empire was even more liberal when it comes to that, in that they left entire countries to govern themselves, and they solely wanted political fealty, really, and that as long as you bear allegiance to us, okay, and pay taxes, we actually don't even want anything from you. So the Ottoman Empire was even more liberal, which is why actually so many of the Balkan countries remained under Ottoman rule until the very end, because it was a fairly comfortable political status quo between the two.
So I think that's really interesting, and I think the Ottomans are an interesting line to tie the old with the new, obviously, because they carried on that tradition, but they welcomed the refugees in the 1400s onwards, and actually then they had a very interesting role to play in the 20th century. I think this was really, really interesting. I wanted to go a lot deeper, and I've got, actually, looking at our list of questions, a lot of them were 20th century. We never actually got around to them. So I think it'll be very interesting to do a round two, and to discuss that further with you. And I'm sure this has been enlightening and has opened up a lot of new areas of research for our listeners as well. So Jazakallah khair for your time. Really appreciate it. We'll end there, inshallah, and we'll be back with a round two of this on another episode of the Islam Through the Ages podcast. Now, just quickly before we go, how can people find you? Are you on Twitter or?
I'm not on Twitter currently. You can find me on the Cambridge University website. You can find me on the Wolf Institute website. You can feel free to email me, contact me. I'm happy to chat. And LinkedIn or any of those, so Facebook, LinkedIn, those types of social media, I'm happy to connect with people.
Jazakallah khair. And if anyone has any questions either for part two or further kind of guests or different topics that you want us to cover, you can email us on islamthroughtheages@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and we'll be back, inshallah, shortly with another episode. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.